Hey guys, tonight we begin with the unshakable facts about the Middle Ages. You know, the ones people repeat at dinner parties, in documentaries, and in high school history classes, and that are completely wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the most stubborn myths about the Middle Ages is that people thought the earth was as flat as a serving tray, and if you sailed far enough, you'd plunge into the abyss like a medieval lemming. The image is tempting. Nervous sailors peeking over the ship's edge, wondering if they'd see dragons or just a really long fall. Unfortunately for that dramatic mental picture, medieval scholars already knew the earth was round. In fact, they'd known for centuries. The ancient Greeks had measured it with sticks, shadows, and math, which is the historical equivalent of winning a Nobel Prize with a ruler and a bit of sunshine. Eratosthenes did it in the 3rd century BCE, and his method was still taught in the Middle Ages. So no, your average monk wasn't lying awake at night terrified of cosmic cliffs. The flat earth myth actually got popular thanks to 19th century writers who wanted to make the medieval period look like one long cosplay of ignorance. Washington Irving's biography of Columbus painted the explorer as bravely defying all the flat earthers of his day. The reality? The real argument in Columbus's time wasn't, is it round? But, how big is it? Columbus thought it was much smaller than it actually was, a mistake that, without the Americas conveniently blocking his way, would have meant starving to death somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. Even regular sailors knew about the Earth's curve. They watched masts disappear over the horizon before the hull. You don't need a PhD to notice that unless you're actively trying to ignore it. Medieval art even showed globes in Christ's hand, and kings posed with them like they'd just invented geography. Not something you'd do if you believed you were ruling over the world's largest frisbee. Ah yes, the classic mental image. Every medieval person was a filthy, flea-ridden creature who feared water like it was witchcraft. Supposedly, they roamed the streets smelling like a combination of wet sheep and disappointment. It's a satisfying caricature, but much like that flat earth nonsense, it's wrong. In reality, medieval Europeans bathed far more than people give them credit for. Public bathhouses were common in towns, often operating as social hubs where people could catch up on gossip, seal business deals, and, in some cases, enjoy additional services for an extra fee. Let's just say some bathhouses were the medieval equivalent of a full-service spa, and leave it at that. Even in rural areas, washing wasn't a rarity. Rivers, lakes, and barrels in courtyards all served the purpose. Soap existed, made from animal fat and lye, and while it wasn't exactly lavender-scented artisanal luxury, it got the job done. Monks had strict washing schedules, and royalty sometimes had private bathrooms complete with heated water. The medieval elite didn't just sit around marinating in their own grime. They commissioned elaborate perfumed baths, often with herbs like rosemary, sage, and mint. Basically, they were doing medieval aromatherapy before it became overpriced in modern wellness stores. So why the myth? Blame later centuries. During the Renaissance, and especially after the 16th century, medical theory shifted toward believing that bathing opened the pores and let in bad air. So ironically, people in later eras bathed less than their medieval ancestors. This means your average 14th century baker was probably cleaner than a 17th century French courtier, though he smelled more like bread than expensive cologne. Of course, bathing didn't always mean entire body scrub. Sometimes it was just washing the face, hands, and whatever else was socially necessary to avoid scandal. But the idea that they avoided water altogether is just lazy historical slander. Even peasants took advantage of rainwater, which was free, clean, and falling directly on their heads whether they liked it or not. The idea that medieval people were all knee-high to a grasshopper is one of history's laziest myths. If it were true, Jousting tournaments would have looked like angry toddlers trying to poke each other off hobby horses. The truth? Most medieval men averaged about 170 centimeters and women around 160 centimeters. Not giants, but certainly not small enough to hide in a wine barrel, though some may have tried during tax season. Archaeologists have dug up enough skeletons to confirm that the Middle Ages produced plenty of tall individuals, especially among the better-fed classes. Knights weren't exactly ducking under doors, but they weren't clanging their helmets on the lintels either. Part of the confusion comes from medieval architecture. Low doorways weren't designed for little people. They were designed for little heat loss. Medieval builders understood insulation better than they understood hygiene, and if that meant you cracked your forehead every time you entered the pantry, so be it. Beds were also shorter, but that's because people often slept half upright, which they thought prevented vapours from suffocating them. Of course, if you'd been breathing medieval air, you'd worry about vapours too. The nobility, with diets rich in meat, dairy, and imported delicacies, often had a height advantage over peasants who mostly lived on bread and cabbage. Chroniclers, eager to please their patrons, inflated royal statues in their writing. So in some accounts, kings loomed like cathedral spires, which is impressive until you realise these same scribes also claimed the monarch could kill a boar with a stern look. Yes, poor nutrition, disease, and grueling labour did stunt some people's growth, but the overall picture is far more varied than the miniature medieval man stereotype suggests. There were lanky guards, stocky masons, and more than a few market women who could knock you flat for asking if their husband was home. So no, the medieval world was not populated by a race of human collectibles. They were people much like us, except with worse dental care and an alarming tolerance for cold drafts. If you believe every high school history textbook from 50 years ago, the Middle Ages were a 1,000-year blackout between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. No art, no science, no progress. Just peasants tilling mud while monks argued about angels on pinheads. In reality, medieval Europe was far from an intellectual wasteland. The period produced universities, Gothic cathedrals, mechanical clocks, and more philosophical debates than a modern internet forum. People didn't stop thinking after Rome fell. They just thought about different things, like how to keep your soup from freezing in January, or whether it was morally acceptable to charge interest on a loan. The dark label comes partly from later Renaissance writers who like to flatter themselves. By making the Middle Ages look like a cultural pit, they could make their own era seem like a blazing dawn. It's a marketing trick as old as time. To sell your product, trash the competition. Unfortunately, the smear campaign stuck. There's also the problem of lighting. We see medieval interiors today in dim candlelight during reenactments, and our brains translate that into, they lived in darkness. In truth, they had windows, oil lamps, and torches. But yes, it was still darker than your average LED-lit kitchen. And yet people somehow managed to read, write, and create manuscripts so intricate they could make your eyes ache. As for dull, life in the Middle Ages could be anything but. Tournaments featured men in armour knocking each other unconscious for sport. Travelling entertainers performed acrobatics, music, and comedy, some of which would get you banned from YouTube. Markets were noisy, chaotic affairs where you could buy a chicken, hire a scribe, and get your teeth pulled, all in the same street. Sure, there were long, uneventful winters where nothing happened except gossip and stew, but that's true of any era. The difference is, medieval people couldn't distract themselves with television. Instead, they invented elaborate games, told stories, and occasionally staged a festival so wild the church had to step in. Somewhere along the way, people got the idea that medieval Europeans lived on nothing but boiled cabbage and regret. This is partly because modern historians like to focus on what peasants ate, which, granted, was not exactly a Michelin-starred affair. But to claim all medieval food was bland is like judging modern cuisine by gas station sandwiches. The truth? Medieval kitchens could turn out dishes so heavily spiced that your tongue might file a formal complaint. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These weren't rare, special occasion seasonings for the elite. They were dumped into meat, fish, and even wine with the enthusiasm of a teenager using cologne for the first time. Spices were expensive, yes, but they were a status symbol, the medieval equivalent of having a sports car parked in your dining hall. And it wasn't just about spice. Cooks in noble households loved colour and spectacle. A roasted peacock might be served with its feathers reattached for drama, or a meat pie might contain live birds that would fly out when cut open. An early form of dinner theatre, though probably terrifying for the birds. Sweet and savoury combinations were popular too. Meat could be cooked with dried fruits and honey, which sounds odd until you realise you've probably eaten pineapple on pizza. Even the common folk had ways to make food more interesting. Ale, onions, herbs like parsley and sage, and preserved fish added variety to the otherwise bread-heavy diet. Sure, sometimes variety just meant this bread is mouldy, but still edible if you scrape it. But it wasn't all misery. Seasonal fairs and markets also offered chances to try exotic goods, like imported almonds, or, if you were really lucky, a slice of candied ginger. The real blandness came during times of scarcity, famines, sieges, or winters, when the cabbage barrel ran dry. That's when meals became survival rations. But when times were good, medieval cooking could be vibrant, flavorful, and sometimes alarmingly experimental. Somewhere, Hollywood decided that a knight in full plate armor was basically a helpless tin can, wobbling around until someone pushed them over like a clumsy fridge. You've seen the image. A knight falls on his back and can't get up, lying there like an overturned turtle, while his opponent politely waits to stab him. Reality check. A well-fitted suit of plate armor weighed about 45–60 pounds. That's the same as wearing a loaded hiking backpack, except instead of straining your shoulders, the weight was evenly distributed over your whole body. Medieval armourers were not in the business of producing metal prisons. They were in the business of keeping you alive while you swung a sword at someone else trying to kill you. Knights could run, jump, mount horses without cranes, and yes, even do somersaults. There are surviving training manuals showing fully armoured fighters grappling, rolling, and wrestling like they were auditioning for medieval WWE. Try doing that in your jeans and tell me who's more restricted. So where did the turtle knight myth come from? One culprit is a 15th century tournament style where contestants wore extra armour, heavier, bulkier, and designed purely for jousting. Yes, that made you about as agile as a garden shed, but that wasn't combat armour. That was sports equipment, the medieval equivalent of an American football player's pads. You wouldn't judge a sprinter's speed by watching someone in a mascot costume, would you? Another culprit is Victorian-era reenactments. 19th century medieval armour was often decorative, poorly fitted, or made of thicker steel for display, not battle. Put a stiff, overweight gentleman into one of those, and of course he moved like a malfunctioning wind-up toy. And then, of course, we have modern TV shows that think a slow, awkward knight makes for better slapstick than a swift, dangerous one. Truth be told, if knights had been as clumsy as pop culture suggests, the Middle Ages would have been very short indeed. Because no one survives a battlefield by lying on the ground like a stranded beetle waiting for rescue. In reality, armour didn't make you immobile. It made you confident. The kind of confidence that lets you walk into a sword fight and think, I've got this, rather than, I hope my will is up to date. If you believe most movies, the medieval Catholic Church had a special committee whose only job was to burn books, glare at astronomers, and shout, "Heretic," at anyone with a magnifying glass. It's a great image. The grim monk smashing telescopes in slow motion while lightning flashes outside. Unfortunately, reality is less inquisition and more funding agency. Yes, there were cases where the church clashed with specific ideas. Galileo sends his regards. But the sweeping idea that the medieval church banned science is about as accurate as saying medieval peasants lived in mud huts all year round. Many of the very people doing science back then were clergy. Monks copied ancient Greek and Arabic manuscripts, ran observatories and experimented with medicine, in between brewing beer, which frankly was their most beloved experiment. Medieval universities, where a lot of the science happened, were largely church-founded and church-funded. These weren't weekend hobby clubs. They were structured institutions producing scholars who debated astronomy, mathematics, optics, and anatomy. The medieval Dark Ages narrative comes partly from Enlightenment writers who thought trashing the Middle Ages made their own era look smarter. Spoiler, smug marketing campaigns are not a modern invention. The Church didn't hate science, it just preferred it to fit within certain philosophical and theological boundaries. If you wanted to claim the Earth was round, no problem. Scholars had known that since antiquity. If you wanted to claim the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, well, now you were poking at cosmic hierarchy, and that could get awkward at dinner parties in Rome. It's also worth noting that much of Europe's scientific tradition survived precisely because church institutions preserved it. Without those dusty monks in cold scriptoria, half of Aristotle's works might have been lost to mice and mildew. And without the church's interest in calculating the date of Easter, medieval Europe might have lagged centuries behind in astronomy. You've probably heard it in some half-baked history meme. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy was 30. Cue the mental image of a medieval peasant celebrating his 29th birthday, like it's his retirement party. The reality, however, is a bit less tragic, and a lot less fun for the wow, they were so primitive crowd. That number, the infamous 30, is an average. And averages are tricky things. Averages take everyone into account, including babies. And here's the kicker. Medieval infant mortality rates were brutal. A lot of children didn't survive their first 5 years thanks to disease, famine, or simply being too curious around open wells. Those early deaths dragged the average way down. If you made it out of childhood alive, your odds of living into your 50s or even 60s were decent, provided you avoided wars, plagues, and the occasional suspiciously pointed dagger in political circles. Medieval records are full of people who lived long enough to complain about kids these days in Latin. The idea that everyone keeled over at 30 also ignores the existence of elderly monarchs, bishops, farmers, and artisans. Even peasants could, and did, live into old age. Archaeological evidence shows plenty of skeletons with worn-down teeth, healed fractures and arthritis. Clear signs of people who had been around the block for decades. So why do we keep believing the "everyone died young" myth? Because it makes history sound more dramatic, and because saying the average was 30, but that's due to high child mortality, doesn't have the same punch at cocktail parties. Here's a modern analogy. If tomorrow every toddler tragically vanished, grim, I know, but stick with me, the average age of the population would skyrocket. Conversely, if a third of all babies died at birth, the average would plummet, even if the surviving adults were still out there gardening at 75. In short, medieval people weren't biological mayflies. They didn't hit 30 and instantly drop dead like an episode of Game of Thrones. Life was harder, medicine was worse, but if you made it through the deadly roulette wheel of childhood, you had a fair shot at becoming the village elder. If you believe the movies, every medieval village had a weekly witch-burning day, right after market and just before the pub opened. But despite the fiery reputation, medieval Europe was not actually lighting up the skies with constant witch pyres. In fact, most of the large-scale witch burnings happened after the Middle Ages, during the early modern period. So technically, if you time-travelled to the 1300s, hoping for a front-row seat at a witch trial, you'd probably be bored, or recruited to fix a broken wagon wheel. The medieval church itself was surprisingly sceptical about witchcraft in its earlier centuries. The official line in the 10th and 11th centuries was that most witches were just deluded people or victims of superstition. Some church manuals even stated outright that believing in witches' supernatural powers was itself heresy. A nice twist, where the witch hunters would be the ones in trouble. Of course, there were occasional prosecutions, but burning wasn't the go-to method. Hanging, exile, or good old-fashioned public shaming were more common punishments. Fire was expensive, and medieval towns weren't exactly eager to waste good timber on your neighbour who muttered over herbs. The real witch-burning craze didn't hit until the late 15th to 17th centuries, fueled by a mix of religious conflict, social panic, and the printing press spreading the Malleus Maleficarum. Basically a how-to guide for spotting witches, written by a man who was rejected by several women and apparently took it very personally. In the actual medieval period, accusations of magic were often more political or personal than supernatural. If your sheep went missing, you blamed the neighbor you didn't like. If the harvest failed, you accused the cranky old woman who didn't go to church. And if your husband was unfaithful, well, maybe that young, attractive widow down the lane was bewitching him. Convenient, isn't it? So, while witch burning has become shorthand for medieval brutality, it's a bit like blaming the 1990s for TikTok. Wrong century, wrong technology, same moral panic. The medieval era had plenty of real horrors, but constant pyres for spellcasters wasn't one of them. In other words, medieval witches spent more time being gossiped about than barbecued. The bonfire stories came later, courtesy of a Europe that had better printing, worse paranoia, and far too much free time. If popular culture is to be believed, medieval peasants were essentially walking mud statues, voiceless, powerless, and just waiting for a knight to gallop over them on the way to a tournament. The truth? They actually had more rights than many people assume, just not the sort you'd brag about on a dating profile. Yes, peasants were at the bottom of the feudal hierarchy, but that didn't mean they were legally invisible. Many were bound to the land as serfs, but they still had recognized rights in manorial courts, which were like local legal clubs, minus the velvet ropes, and plus a lot more disputes over pigs. These courts allowed peasants to challenge fines, settle quarrels, and even sue their lord in some cases, though winning was a bit like winning a staring contest with the sun. They also had access to customary rights, the right to gather firewood, graze animals on common land, or fish in certain rivers. These commons were crucial to survival, and were fiercely defended. Try to take away a peasant's right to gather fallen branches, and you might wake up to find your hayrick mysteriously on fire. Taxes and dues were a burden, yes, but they were usually predictable. Peasants knew what they owed and could sometimes negotiate, which is more than can be said for your internet provider today. And while they owed labour to their lord, there were limits. The lord couldn't just demand you build him a moat because he got bored on a Tuesday. And then there's the myth that peasants never left their village, chained forever to the same patch of dirt. In reality, many travelled to markets, fairs, and even other towns for seasonal work. The road wasn't closed to them. It just required time, permission, and the ability to ignore every roadside alehouse on the way. So no, medieval peasants weren't living in some legal void where the lord could do whatever he wanted without consequence. Their rights might look small to us, but in their world, they were worth defending, sometimes to the death, or at least until after the harvest. The no rights myth survives because it's simple and dramatic, but real medieval life was more nuanced. Peasants were not only subjects, but also players in the complex game of feudal give and take. And like any good game, the rules were there, even if the house usually won. If you picture medieval castles as giant, cold slabs of grey stone looming over a perpetually muddy village, congratulations. You've been watching too many documentaries shot on cloudy days in November. In reality, medieval castles could be surprisingly colourful. And no, I don't mean from bloodstains after a siege. Castles were often plastered and painted in bright, eye-watering colours. Walls might be whitewashed to gleam in the sun, painted in stripes, or decorated with murals. Think less gothic misery, and more medieval Instagram filter set to sunny and gaudy. Even stone walls, when left exposed, were sometimes tinted with pigments to give them a warmer look. It turns out medieval people didn't want to live in a grim, dark set from Game of Thrones. They wanted somewhere that looked impressive, not depressing. Inside, things got even flashier. Great halls were draped with colourful tapestries, not just for decoration, but also to keep out drafts, and to cover up whatever the masons had messed up. Heraldic banners, carved wooden ceilings, and painted shields added splashes of colour everywhere. Floors might be tiled with intricate patterns or strewn with fresh rushes, and yes, those rushes could hide some unmentionable debris. But at least they were replaced regularly, in theory. Even the furniture was painted and gilded. Chairs, chests, and beds were often carved and then decorated in reds, blues, and golds. If you walked into a medieval noble's bedchamber expecting grey stone and minimalism, you'd probably need sunglasses. So why do we think castles were depressing? Partly because paint fades and plaster crumbles, leaving the bare stone skeleton behind. Archaeology can tell us they were once colourful, but seeing a ruin in person is like meeting a rock star at 80 and assuming they always looked like that. That's not to say castles were all cosy and cheerful. They were fortresses after all, with draughty passages, uneven stairs, and a smell that was somewhere between wood smoke and horse. But visually, they were built to impress allies, intimidate enemies, and remind peasants who was in charge. In short, medieval castles weren't grey and joyless. They were the architectural equivalent of wearing a crown while shouting your family crest in primary colours. The bleakness is just what's left when the centuries strip away the medieval paint job. The Black Death was, without question, one of the deadliest pandemics in history. It tore through Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia in the mid-14th century like a plague-themed carnival ride nobody wanted to be on. But the idea that it killed half the world is ambitious, even for a disease that made medieval doctors think strapping live chickens to your armpits was sound medical advice. In truth, historians estimate it killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's population, which is horrifying enough without rounding it up to half the globe. Entire villages were wiped out, trade routes went eerily quiet, and you could probably buy a house for the price of a turnip, if you could find anyone alive to sell it to you. But the rest of the world, not quite so devastated. China and the Middle East suffered massive losses, yes, but Africa, the Americas, and much of Oceania were untouched. In 1347, half the world didn't even know Europe existed, much less that it was in the middle of a pandemic apocalypse. The notion that everyone was affected is more of a dramatic storytelling flourish, like claiming every medieval knight was a chivalrous hero, or that every princess was blonde. That said, the psychological impact of the plague on affected regions was enormous. People interpreted it as divine punishment, bad air, or the result of foreign merchants with suspicious cargo. Modern germ theory was centuries away, so medieval prevention methods ranged from burning incense to carrying posies to, my personal favourite, avoiding bathing, because they thought it opened the pores to bad air. Spoiler: avoiding bathing did not help. The plague also reshaped economies. Labour shortages meant surviving peasants could demand better pay and conditions. Some even left their manors to work elsewhere, legally or otherwise. This sudden shift in bargaining power was about as welcome to the nobility as a rat in their soup. If Hollywood has taught us anything, it's that in the Middle Ages, every legal dispute could be solved by two people whacking each other with swords until one of them was dead, preferably in the rain, with dramatic music. In reality, trial by combat was more like the flashy legal loophole you could technically invoke, but almost no one actually did. The idea was simple. If you were accused of a crime, you could prove your innocence by fighting your accuser. The thinking went that God would favour the righteous, which sounds noble until you remember that God's will often looked suspiciously like the better fighter won. And yes, this applied even in civil disputes. Imagine suing your neighbour over a stolen cow and ending up in a muddy field, trying not to get your helmet caved in. But trial by combat wasn't the medieval equivalent of Judge Judy. In most places it was rare, regulated, and often replaced by other methods like oaths, witness testimony, or, everyone's favourite, trial by ordeal, which involved things like holding red-hot irons or dunking people in rivers. Combat was expensive, dangerous, and socially awkward if your opponent happened to be your brother-in-law. When it was used, the rules could be bizarre. There were standardized weapons, designated arenas, and even time limits. And contrary to popular belief, it wasn't always to the death. Sometimes the fight ended when one party was too injured to continue, or just yielded, because they realized God probably wasn't on their side after all. One of the most famous late examples was the 1386 duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in France, immortalized in The Last Duel. It was a big deal precisely because it was so rare by that point. When such trials did happen, They drew huge crowds because, let's face it, medieval entertainment options were limited, and two angry nobles fighting for divine judgment was basically the Super Bowl. By the late Middle Ages, trial by combat had faded into legal obscurity, lingering only as an archaic curiosity. In England, it technically remained on the books until 1819, when some clever defendant actually tried to demand it, and lawmakers quickly realised maybe they should take that option away before someone got ideas. So, no. Medieval courts weren't just armoured brawls in disguise. Most disputes were settled with paperwork, not polearms. Which is probably just as well. Most lawyers can't swing a sword. If you believe the stereotype, medieval medicine was basically just apply leeches until patient stops complaining or stops breathing, whichever comes first. And yes, bloodletting with leeches was a thing. But it wasn't the only thing, and medieval healers didn't just sit around waiting for their next slimy prescription to wriggle into action. In reality, medicine in the Middle Ages was an eclectic mix of inherited classical knowledge, folk remedies, astrology, and the occasional deeply questionable experiment. Physicians, apothecaries, midwives, and barber surgeons all had their roles. The physicians wore long robes and tried to impress you with Latin phrases. Apothecaries dispensed herbs, powders, and mysterious potions, some helpful, some placebo, and some that probably should have come with a may cause death label. Barber surgeons, meanwhile, could cut your hair, pull your tooth, and amputate your leg, all in the same appointment. Efficiency at its finest. Leeches were part of a broader belief in balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you had too much of one, your body was out of balance, and the cure might involve draining some blood, inducing vomiting, or giving you a laxative strong enough to power a small mill wheel. But medieval medicine wasn't just trial and frequent error. Herbal treatments like willow bark for pain, garlic for infections, and honey for wounds actually had merit, and are still used in some form today. Hospitals run by religious orders provided care, even if care sometimes meant prayers and a clean bed. And in Islamic Spain and the Byzantine Empire, medicine could be surprisingly advanced, with detailed surgical manuals and accurate anatomy drawings, though Europe often preferred to stick to Galen's 200-year-old theories instead. Yes, some treatments were ridiculous. You might be prescribed a potion made from powdered emeralds, or be told to wear a dead mole around your neck to cure a cough. But there was a method to the madness, at least in their minds, and not every patient ended up worse off than when they arrived. If you go by Hollywood, every medieval day began with a rooster screaming in your ear, followed by 16 hours of ploughing mud until your hands fell off, and ended with either a plague death or being burned as a witch. The Middle Ages, we're told, were basically one long misery marathon, interrupted only by the occasional public hanging to lift the spirits. Now, yes, life wasn't exactly a spa retreat. Famine, war, disease, and the occasional Viking raid were very real problems. But the idea that everyone walked around perpetually gloomy, staring at the dirt while sighing is, well, dirt poor history. Medieval people laughed, sang, told jokes, and celebrated whenever they could, often with festivals so raucous they'd make modern music festivals look like Sunday school picnics. Weddings weren't stiff affairs. They were days-long parties with dancing, feasting, and enough wine to make you forget the groom's family still owed you 3 goats. Even peasants had time for sports, games, and elaborate holiday traditions, because if you're going to live without Wi-Fi, you may as well get really good at archery. And the food. Despite the gruel 3 times a day myth, seasonal produce, meats, breads, cheeses, and even imported spices made it to many tables. Sure, not everyone was gnawing on roast swan dusted with saffron, but they weren't living on sadness soup either. Art, music, and storytelling thrived. People embroidered beautiful clothing, carved intricate woodwork, and told epic tales. Not because they were bored, but because beauty mattered. The idea that life was only about survival is an invention of modern cynicism, looking back through smudged glasses. And yes, The average lifespan statistic gets thrown around to prove life was short and miserable, but that number is skewed by high infant mortality. If you made it past childhood, you could easily live into your 60s, which is more than enough time to develop opinions about the neighbour's sheep. Medieval life had struggles, absolutely, but it also had joy, humour, music, and love, all the things that make life worth living. The only people who think the Middle Ages were nothing but misery are the same ones who assume medieval people never bathed. Spoiler. They did, just maybe not as often as you'd like. On the endless Mongolian steppe, where the land stretches so far that the horizon seems to be the edge of the world, the sudden appearance of a rider was never just a coincidence. It was a moment of fate. For centuries, the nomadic Mongols believed that every guest was sent by Tenga, the eternal blue sky, as a test of honor. And so, when the dust of hooves began to rise in the distance, life inside the jar, the felt-covered yurt, shifted in an instant. Hospitality among the Mongols was not a polite social nicety. It was a sacred obligation. The vastness of the steppe was both beautiful and dangerous. Days of riding could separate one settlement from another, and a night without shelter could kill. To deny a traveller warmth, food, and safety was to risk their life, and in Mongol belief, to invite misfortune upon yourself. Whether the visitor was kin, a wandering trader, or even someone who had once been an enemy, the rule was the same. You welcomed them as if they were a long-lost friend. In this way, hospitality was not simply about survival, it was about dignity. It affirmed a shared humanity across the vast emptiness, binding strangers through food, warmth, and respect. Out here, on the wind-swept plains, you could never know if the stranger at your door might one day be you. One of the most striking aspects of Mongol hospitality was its indifference to old grudges, a quality that baffled outsiders and even unnerved diplomats. In the settled kingdoms beyond the steppe, hospitality might be extended to allies, merchants, or kin, but rarely to someone who had once raided your lands or fought against you. On the Mongolian plains, however, the rules of survival erased these boundaries. It was not that the Mongols forgot past wrongs, far from it. Feuds could span generations, and vengeance was a cultural currency. But there was an understanding, born of the brutal realities of nomadic life, that out here, the laws of hospitality stood above personal disputes, at least for as long as a guest remained within the jar. Imagine a warrior, weary from weeks on the road, riding into the camp of a man whose cousin he had once struck down in battle. In another world, this might end with a blade in the gut. On the steppe, it ended with a bowl of steaming mutton broth, a bed by the hearth, and shared stories late into the night. The moment he stepped through that felt doorway, he was no longer an enemy. He was a Zuni Kun, a person of the moment, a traveller under the host's protection. This sacred pause in hostility was partly practical. Killing a guest was considered an insult to Tenga, and a violation that could stain a family's honour for generations. But it was also a matter of prestige. The greater a man's generosity, the more his name travelled across the steppe, carried in the stories of those who had eaten at his fire. In Mongol culture, reputation was a form of currency just as valuable as livestock. There was a quiet calculation in this kindness too. A former enemy who had been warmed and fed might think twice before drawing his bow against you in the future. Or perhaps out of respect, he might even carry your goodwill to his own people, easing tensions without a single arrow loosed. In this way, the Mongols practiced a form of diplomacy that didn't rely on parchment treaties or royal seals. It was diplomacy by firelight and shared bread, a reminder that even in the harshest land on earth, peace could begin with nothing more than a cup of fermented mare's milk. Hospitality among the Mongols was not a haphazard gesture. It was a choreography of respect, each movement deliberate, each object charged with meaning. When a guest approached, the sequence began long before they crossed the threshold of the jar. First, the host would step outside to greet them, standing with open posture but never rushing forward. To hurry could seem desperate, To linger too long inside could seem cold. Balance was everything. The guest would be invited to dismount, and the host might take the horse's reins, signalling that both rider and mount were now under their care. The door flap of the ger, always facing south to welcome the sun, was lifted for the guest. Inside, the fire at the centre burned steadily, its smoke rising through the tonneau, the round smoke hole at the top. This fire was not just for warmth, it was the hearth spirit, a guardian of the household. Guests were expected to step carefully around it, never to step over it, for to do so was a deep insult. Seating arrangements carried their own silent language. The north side, directly opposite the door, was the place of honour reserved for the guest. Here they would sit on cushions or carpets, facing both the hearth and the entrance, a position of respect and security. Weapons, if carried, were either set aside or placed visibly to the side, a subtle assurance that no harm was intended. Then came the offering of airag, the fermented mare's milk, poured into a silver or wooden bowl. The guest accepted it with both hands, a gesture showing they came with no hidden blade. To refuse the drink was unthinkable. It was to reject not just the liquid, but the bond it symbolized. Alongside it came bread, curds, or meat, depending on the host's wealth and the season. Conversation began slowly, often with blessings and remarks about the weather, safe topics to ease into deeper matters. This ritual wasn't just politeness. It was a way to affirm trust in a land where trust meant survival. Every gesture, from how the bowl was held to where the guest sat, reinforced the idea that for this moment, beneath this roof, they belonged. For the Mongols, these steps weren't formalities. They were a living thread to their ancestors, binding the present to centuries of tradition. On the Mongolian steppe, food was never just nourishment. It was an unspoken contract. To share a meal was to share trust, and once you had eaten at another's fire, there existed an invisible thread between you that was not easily cut. This was especially true when the offering was airag, the fermented mare's milk that stood at the centre of nomadic hospitality. Airag was more than a drink. Its creation was a labour that reflected the rhythm of the steppe. Mares were milked several times a day. The milk poured into a leather bag hung by the jeer's entrance, where it would be stirred and churned each time someone passed. This constant motion transformed it into a lightly alcoholic, tangy brew, both refreshing and symbolic. To accept it was to accept the protection of the household. To drain the bowl was to seal that acceptance. Alongside the airag came the solid companions of the nomadic table. Bortsog, small fried bread pieces, offered a crisp sweetness that contrasted with the drink's sour tang. Arul, dried curds hardened by sun and wind, were a test of the teeth and a reminder of the steppe's unforgiving nature. Food designed to last through long journeys. If the family had slaughtered an animal recently, the guest might be served hot mutton soup, rich with fat, accompanied by thick noodles or dumplings known as booze. The order in which these foods were offered carried meaning. Airag almost always came first. It was the initial handshake between host and guest. Bread or curds followed to steady the stomach. Meat was the ultimate sign of honour, for livestock were wealth, and to serve fresh meat meant the host had parted with something valuable for your sake. Eating together was not a rushed affair. The guest was encouraged to take seconds, thirds if they could, for a full belly was proof of a host's generosity. In turn, the guest might leave behind small gifts, a handful of tea bricks, a pouch of tobacco, or simply the promise of returned kindness on another day. In this exchange, food and drink became something more than sustenance. They were a treaty written in flavour, understood across languages and borders. On the vast steppe, where ink and parchment were rare, such treaties were far more enduring. The Mongol steppe was never an isolated realm. It was a crossroads. Merchants from the Silk Road, Persian envoys, Chinese scholars, and even bewildered European travellers all found themselves at the flap of a Mongol ger, blinking into the warm glow of the hearth after days or weeks in the merciless wind. And regardless of origin, creed or appearance, They were welcomed according to the same sacred code that bound every nomadic household. For outsiders, this welcome could feel almost unreal. Imagine a Venetian merchant, used to the cautious suspicion of Mediterranean ports, suddenly being ushered into a felt-covered home in the middle of nowhere. Before he could explain his purpose, he would be handed a steaming bowl of broth, a hunk of bread, and a cup of airag, which, for the uninitiated, could be a shock to the palate. Yet to refuse was unthinkable. The host's pride was poured into that bowl. Many of these foreign guests noted in their writings that Mongol hospitality was remarkably unconditional. There were no demands for payment, no weighing of whether you were worth the food or shelter. That said, a wise traveller knew to offer some token in return before departure. Tea, cloth, beads, or even a song from their homeland. Such gestures didn't pay for the hospitality. They honoured it. Language barriers rarely proved a problem. The rituals of welcome, seating the guest in the place of honour, offering food with both hands, refilling their cup before it was empty, spoke louder than any words. Even the order of dishes communicated trust. Airag first, then curds, then meat. By the time real conversation began, often through interpreters or in a mix of signs and shared words, the foundation of mutual respect had already been laid. These encounters weren't just kindness for kindness's sake. They were also threads in a much larger web. A well-treated traveller would carry stories of generosity across deserts and seas, burnishing the host's reputation far beyond the reach of their own hooves. In a culture where fame could travel faster than armies, a single act of welcome could be as powerful as 100 warriors. Thus, the Mongols' openness to strangers wasn't naive. It was strategic, spiritual, and deeply human all at once. On the Mongolian steppe, treaties were not drafted in ink. They were tasted in broth and sealed in shared cups of airag. Hospitality wasn't just kindness. It was politics performed around a fire. A guest could arrive as a wary emissary from a rival clan and leave as an ally, bound by the memory of generosity as much as by any spoken agreement. When two groups sought peace or cooperation, the first step was rarely a formal meeting. Instead, the host clan would prepare a feast. Horses would be slaughtered, an extravagant gesture, for horse meat was reserved for important occasions. The ger would be readied to receive the visitors, with carpets and cushions freshly beaten, and the finest utensils polished until they gleamed in the lamplight. The guests would be seated in the place of honour, directly opposite the door, a silent signal that they were under the household's full protection. The food was the language of diplomacy. The richer the spread, meats, fresh dairy, sweets, the clearer the message. We value this meeting, and we have the wealth to honour you. In Mongol culture, to offer less than your best at such a moment would be to admit weakness or disinterest. Conversations during these gatherings were never rushed. They began with blessings and small talk, easing both sides into comfort. A host might recount the bravery of the guest's ancestors, or speak of mutual threats from distant tribes. Between courses, cups were refilled again and again, and with each round, the atmosphere softened. The line between negotiation and celebration blurred. This ritual worked on a deeper level than mere words. Sharing food and shelter was a visceral reminder that survival on the steppe depended on cooperation. When you had eaten at someone's fire, the thought of turning your bow against them carried a weight that was hard to ignore. By the time the feast ended, the visitors often left with more than full bellies. They carried new loyalties. The understanding might be as simple as a promise to trade, or as grand as a pledge of military aid. And while no parchment recorded these bonds, they endured in memory, upheld by honour, and the certainty that future visits would be met with the same warmth. In this way, Mongol hospitality was not just tradition, it was statecraft, woven into the very fabric of survival and power on the steppe. To step inside a Mongol ger was to enter not just a home, but a sacred space layered with unspoken laws. A guest might be welcomed with open arms, but that didn't mean they could behave however they pleased. On the steppe, hospitality came with a code, and to break it was to risk offending your host, or worse, the spirits that guarded the household. The most important rule began at the threshold. Never step on the wooden doorframe. It was more than a piece of carpentry. It symbolized the boundary between the wild world outside and the sanctity within. Treading on it was thought to invite misfortune, not only upon the guest, but upon the entire household. Once inside, the hearth was the heart of the ger, and it was treated with deep reverence. Guests never stepped over it, poked at its fire without permission, or placed trash into it. The fire was the spirit of life, its flames linked to the eternal blue sky, and disrespecting it was akin to insulting the gods. Seating had its own unspoken map. The northern section, facing the entrance, was reserved for honoured guests. The west was traditionally the men's side, and the east was the women's. Sitting in the wrong place, especially without being invited, was a breach of etiquette. When food or drink was offered, it was accepted with both hands and without hesitation. To refuse was not only rude, it suggested distrust. Even if the guest disliked Erag's sour tang or found the mutton too fatty, they were expected to take at least a token sip or bite. Complaining about the meal, however subtly, was never acceptable. There were smaller, subtler rules too. Pointing your feet toward the hearth was frowned upon, as was touching someone's head, considered the most sacred part of the body. Weapons were either left outside or kept in plain sight but untouched, signaling peaceful intent. These customs were rarely explained outright. A guest was expected to learn them by observation or prior knowledge. Yet they served a purpose beyond courtesy. They created an atmosphere of mutual respect, ensuring that the fragile trust between host and guest remained unbroken. To abide by these rules was to honor not just your host, but the ancient spirit of the steppe, a spirit that demanded respect from all who traveled under its endless sky. On the Mongolian steppe, the welcome a guest received was never a question. It was a certainty. But what was offered and how it was presented shifted with the turning of the seasons. The vast grasslands lived by a rhythm older than memory, and hospitality moved in step with that cycle. In the warmth of summer, life on the steppe was at its most abundant. Herds grazed on lush grass, mares produced rich milk, and the Erag bags hanging at the ger's entrance were kept in constant motion, ensuring a steady supply for visitors. Fresh dairy dominated the table, clotted cream, yogurt and curds alongside Irag. Bread was plentiful, and feasts could include tender cuts of mutton or goat. Travellers arriving in summer might find themselves drawn into the relaxed social gatherings that dotted the steppe, with music, storytelling and wrestling matches extending into the long twilight hours. Autumn was the season of preparation. Livestock were fattened for the harsh months ahead, and slaughtering began in earnest. Guests in this season might be honoured with korkog, a hearty dish of mutton slow-cooked with hot stones inside a sealed pot, its rich aroma filling the ger. There was a sense of urgency in the air. Every meeting, every shared meal carried an undertone of winter's looming approach. Then came winter, when the steppe turned white and the wind became a living, biting force. Hospitality in this season was as much about survival as tradition. Fresh milk was scarce. Erag gave way to salty milk tea, heavy with butter for warmth and energy. Meat, often dried or frozen in the open air, was the primary fare, sometimes boiled simply to conserve fuel. Guests were invited to sit closer to the hearth, and conversation was subdued, broken by the howl of the wind outside. To turn away a traveller in winter was unthinkable. It was to send them to their death. Spring brought a fragile renewal. Grass returned slowly, and herds began to produce milk again, though supplies were thin. Hospitality was modest in this season, yet no less sincere. A bowl of fresh milk, a small portion of cheese, a promise of better days ahead. In every season, the essence of Mongol hospitality remained unchanged. To offer what you had, without hesitation, and to remind the traveller that even in the most unforgiving land, there was still warmth to be found. Though the Mongol Empire has long since faded into history, the code of hospitality that once bound warriors, herders and traders still breathes in the ger smoke rising over the modern steppe. In cities like Ulaanbaatar, life may be faster, and skyscrapers have replaced yurts in the skyline, but travel beyond the paved roads, and you will find the same ancient welcome waiting. Today, many Mongol families still live nomadically, moving their herds with the seasons, setting up their gers under the vast open sky. A stranger arriving on horseback or by motorbike is greeted much as they would have been centuries ago, with warmth, food, and a seat in the place of honour. Irag is still poured, bread still passed, and the hearth fire still treated with reverence. Even for those who live in towns, the spirit remains. It is not uncommon for travellers to be invited into a home after a chance meeting, offered tea and biscuits while stories are exchanged. The old belief persists that a guest is a gift from Tenga, and to refuse them is to invite bad fortune. This endurance is partly cultural pride. Hospitality is seen as a marker of Mongol identity, a living link to the greatness of their ancestors. But it is also born from the continued realities of the land. The steppe can still be merciless, with vast distances and unpredictable weather. Acts of generosity are not only symbolic, they are practical insurance for the day when you too might be the one seeking shelter. In recent years, tourism has brought new kinds of guests, photographers chasing the golden light, historians retracing the paths of Genghis Khan, backpackers testing themselves against the wilderness. Many leave with stories of being welcomed into gers without prior arrangement, of being fed and sheltered without a single word of money spoken. For the Mongols, this is not charity. It is the fulfillment of a duty, one that transcends wealth, politics, or religion. As long as the eternal blue sky watches over the steppe, they believe the old ways must continue. Thus, Mongol hospitality endures, not as a quaint relic, but as a living, breathing tradition, still powerful enough to turn strangers into friends, and sometimes even former enemies into allies. By the autumn of 1614, Japan was a land outwardly at peace, but inwardly bracing for another storm. The Tokugawa shogunate, founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu after his decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, now ruled from Edo. Officially, Ieyasu had retired, handing the title of shogun to his son, Hidetada. In reality, the old warlord still pulled the strings of power, watching the nation with the wary eyes of a man who knew how quickly unity could shatter. Only one serious rival remained, the Toyotomi clan, once the ruling power of Japan under the legendary Toyotomi Hideyoshi. His son, Toyotomi Hideyori, had been just a child when Sekigahara ended his family's dominance. Now in his early 20s, he was a symbol for all who disliked Tokugawa rule. Hideyori was no mere relic of a fallen dynasty. He was wealthy, politically connected, and most dangerously, entrenched within Osaka Castle, the mightiest fortress in the land. Osaka Castle was more than just stone walls and watchtowers. It was a statement of Toyotomi power. Massive moats, towering ramparts, and storehouses packed with enough food and supplies to withstand a prolonged siege. Merchants, masterless samurai, and ambitious lords still gravitated toward its protection, swelling its garrison. The castle's position in the heart of Japan gave it strategic importance. If a rebellion flared, Osaka could serve as both a rallying point and an impregnable base. Rumors began to swirl through the country. Whispers of Toyotomi allies gathering, of weapons being stockpiled, of secret letters sent to daimyo still loyal to Hideyoshi's memory. The Tokugawa court in Edo heard these reports with increasing alarm. For Ieyasu, this wasn't just about military threat. It was about the possibility of the Toyotomi becoming a political alternative to his rule, drawing discontented warriors like moths to a flame. In public, the two sides maintained a facade of civility. In private, both prepared for the inevitability of war. Ieyasu, the seasoned strategist, understood that to secure the Tokugawa shogunate for generations, the Toyotomi presence in Osaka had to be erased completely. Hideyori, raised in a world of shifting loyalties, knew that to survive, he could not show weakness. The stage was set. Two great houses, one old and calculating, the other young and defiant. both locked in a silent contest of wills beneath the watchful eyes of the entire nation. The fragile peace was about to break. The road to the siege did not begin with a sudden clash of swords, but with deliberate moves in a political game that Tokugawa Ieyasu played better than anyone alive. He knew that open aggression without cause could turn neutral daimyo against him. Instead, he needed a justification, something that would make war seem not just inevitable, but righteous. The spark came in the form of a temple bell. In 1614, the Toyotomi funded the recasting of a great bell for the Hokoji temple in Kyoto. Upon its completion, an inscription was engraved with a Buddhist prayer for peace, ending with the phrase, Kokka Anko, may the nation be at peace. A harmless blessing to most eyes, but to Ieyasu, or rather to those reading the message on his behalf, the specific arrangement of characters could be interpreted as a curse against the Tokugawa clan. The character for peace sat in a way that seemed to separate Ieyasu from long life, and the shogunate pounced on this as evidence of Toyotomi insolence. It was a flimsy pretext, but in the charged political climate, it was enough. Ieyasu's envoys accused Hideyori of plotting rebellion. Letters were dispatched across Japan, warning daimyo that the Toyotomi were preparing for war and must be dealt with before they could destabilize the realm. Many lords, eager to prove loyalty or simply avoid suspicion, began supplying troops and provisions to the Tokugawa cause. For Hideyori, the accusation was both insulting and dangerous. Advisors urged him to make peace, perhaps by sending hostages or dismantling parts of Osaka Castle's fortifications. Yet there was a defiant current in the Toyotomi camp. Many believed that yielding now would only hasten their end. Samurai loyal to his father's memory flooded into Osaka, some of them ronin who had nothing left to lose. The castle's garrison swelled to perhaps 100,000 fighters, a force impressive in size but varied in discipline and loyalty. The stage was now set not for diplomacy, but for confrontation. By autumn, the Tokugawa army, massive, disciplined and well-equipped, was on the move toward Osaka. The political bell had tolled, and now the drums of war began to beat. By late November 1614, the Tokugawa army was on the march. It was a force that dwarfed any Japan had seen since Sekigahara. Estimates ranged from 150,000 to over 200,000 troops, drawn from nearly every domain loyal to the shogunate. Commanded by Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, alongside his son Shogun Hidetada, it moved with the precision of a nation mobilized for final victory. Osaka Castle, however, was not an easy target. Hideyori's defenders numbered perhaps 90,000 to 100,000, an army swollen by waves of masterless ronin. These men, though not bound to any daimyo, brought with them experience from past wars and a willingness to fight with reckless courage. Under the leadership of generals such as Goto Matabe, Kimura Shigenari, and Sanada Yukimura, the legendary tactician from the Sanada clan, the Toyotomi forces prepared to make Osaka an unbreakable bastion. The castle's fortifications were formidable, triple moats, towering stone walls, and massive gates designed to funnel attackers into deadly kill zones. Supply stores brimmed with rice, dried fish, and other essentials, enough to endure a prolonged siege. The defenders were confident that winter's harsh cold would favor them. The Tokugawa army, encamped in the open fields and hastily built forts, would have to endure the freezing winds off Osaka Bay. Ieyasu's strategy was methodical. Rather than launch a reckless frontal assault, he ordered the construction of siege lines encircling the castle. Earthworks, watchtowers, and artillery emplacements began to rise. Cannons, many acquired through Portuguese trade, were positioned to pound the walls. The goal was to choke Osaka into submission, cutting off reinforcements and wearing down morale before the final blow. Inside the castle, Hideyori worked to maintain unity among his diverse allies. The presence of Sanada Yukimura was especially significant. He began constructing a series of outworks known as the Sanada Maru, a defensive barbican on the southwestern side that would soon become the focal point of some of the fiercest fighting in the entire campaign. By December, the siege was fully underway. The moats froze at night, the air rang with the crack of musket fire, and the ground trembled under the impact of cannon shot. Winter had come to Osaka, and with it, the first test of whether the Toyotomi could withstand the might of the Tokugawa. If Osaka Castle was the heart of the Toyotomi defense, then the Sanada Maru was its sharpened spear point. Built by Sanada Yukimura on the southwestern approach to the castle, this fortification was no mere outwork. It was a killing ground designed to bleed the Tokugawa army before they could even touch the main walls. The Sanada Maru's design was cunning. Surrounded by its own moat and connected to the main castle only by a narrow passage, it allowed defenders to concentrate fire on any attacker who dared to approach. High earthen ramparts bristled with matchlock gunners, while concealed firing positions allowed arrows and bullets to rain down from unexpected angles. The Tokugawa, eager to test the defenses, launched a series of assaults in early December. Their numbers were overwhelming, but Yukimura's men, many wearing the red armor that became their grim signature, stood firm. Waves of attackers found themselves mired in mud or scrambling up steep embankments under a storm of shot. Arquebuses cracked in disciplined volleys, cutting down samurai mid-charge. When the enemy drew too close, the defenders counterattacked with spears and swords, pushing them back into the killing zones. Adding to the defenders' advantage were the cannons mounted within the Sanada Maru. Supplied by Hideyori's stockpiles, these guns pounded the Tokugawa siege works, tearing gaps in their lines and scattering troops. The psychological effect was just as potent as the physical damage. Tokugawa soldiers began to dread any order to advance on the redoubt. One assault ended in disaster when the attackers, attempting to storm the walls, were met by a sudden countercharge led by Yukimura himself. His presence on the field, rallying his men with a calm yet unyielding demeanor, became legendary. Tokugawa forces were thrown back, leaving the ground littered with dead and wounded. For Ieyasu, the Sanada Maru was a thorn that refused to be pulled. Weeks of siege had failed to crack it, and each failure emboldened the defenders inside Osaka Castle. Even the bitter cold seemed to favor Yukimura's men, who knew every inch of their fortification and could rotate shifts to keep fresh fighters on the walls. By mid-December, it was clear to the Tokugawa commanders the Sanada Maru could not be taken by direct assault. If Osaka Castle was to fall, it would not be through Yukimura's gate. When direct assaults on Osaka Castle failed, especially the bloody failures at Sanada Maru, Tokugawa Ieyasu shifted his focus from storming the walls to breaking the defenders' will. If he could not breach the gates with steel, he would pound them into submission with stone and iron. By mid-December 1614, the Tokugawa siege lines bristled with artillery. These were no ordinary Japanese cannon. Many had been purchased from Portuguese traders or adapted from European designs. Heavy culverins and smaller swivel guns were dragged into position on raised earthworks, aimed not only at the outer defences, but at the castle's interior. The objective was clear: to turn Osaka into a place where even survival felt like defeat. Day and night, the bombardment began. The roar of cannon fire rolled across the winter air, each shot followed by the splintering crash of wood, the crumble of stone, and sometimes the terrible screams of those caught in the blast. Buildings inside the castle compound, storehouses, barracks, even residences, were smashed apart. Fires broke out, sending plumes of black smoke into the icy sky. But Ieyasu's strategy went beyond physical destruction. The constant noise, the sleepless nights, and the growing sense of helplessness were meant to erode morale. The defenders, though safe behind thick walls and moats, could never relax. Every hour brought the possibility of another deadly strike. Adding to the psychological pressure were rumors spread by Tokugawa agents. Messages were smuggled in or shouted from beyond the moat, promising mercy to those who abandoned Hideyori and swore loyalty to the shogunate. Some defenders dismissed them with contempt. Others, especially the less loyal Ronin, began to wonder if the fight was worth dying for. Inside Osaka, Hideyori and his commanders tried to counter this assault on the spirit. Public ceremonies were held to honor fallen warriors. Food was distributed generously to keep up morale. Sanada Yukimura continued to lead inspections of the walls, a visible reminder that leadership was still strong. Still, the weight of the siege could be felt. The people of Osaka Castle were enduring not just a military campaign, but a slow, grinding war on their senses. Ieyasu knew that in siege warfare, victory often went to the side that could endure the misery longest, and he was betting on the Tokugawa. By late December 1614, weeks of bombardment had taken their toll. Osaka Castle still stood, its main walls and moats had held, but the damage to its outer defences and the constant psychological strain were undeniable. Tokugawa Ieyasu, ever the strategist, recognised that continuing the siege through the worst of winter risked exhausting his own forces and draining his coffers. Instead, he sought to end the campaign on terms that weakened the Toyotomi without the bloodshed of a final assault. Envoys were sent under flags of truce. Officially, the talks were framed as an opportunity to restore peace to the realm. In reality, both sides approached the table with very different goals. For the Tokugawa, the aim was to dismantle Osaka's ability to resist in the future. For Hideyori, it was to preserve his clan's survival and keep the fortress intact for as long as possible. The negotiations were tense. The Tokugawa demanded that Osaka Castle's outer defences, including the massive moats, be filled in and its fortifications reduced. Hideyori's representatives resisted, but the strain of the siege and the desire to protect the civilian population weighed heavily. With supplies still sufficient but morale fraying, the Toyotomi leaders ultimately agreed to a peace settlement. The terms seemed straightforward. The Toyotomi would refrain from military action, and the Tokugawa would withdraw their forces. But Ieyasu had built in a crucial advantage. By filling in the moats and dismantling the strongest outer works, Osaka Castle's defensive power would be irreversibly weakened. In the days that followed, work crews moved in to fill the moats with earth and rubble. The defenders, perhaps relieved to see the end of constant cannon fire, did not fully grasp the strategic disaster this represented. Once the snow melted and the campaigning season returned, their fortress would be far more vulnerable to a renewed attack. By New Year's, the Tokugawa army began its withdrawal. The winter campaign was over. Osaka had survived. Hideyori remained in his castle, and to the casual observer, the peace seemed genuine. But beneath the polite phrases of the truce lay a truth both sides understood. The conflict was only paused, not ended. The castle had lost its fangs, and Ieyasu had no intention of letting the Toyotomi threat linger indefinitely. The next campaign would be decisive. The winter campaign ended with the snow, but peace in Osaka was a fragile illusion. Inside the castle walls, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Fires were lit without fear of cannon shot, markets reopened, and the sound of repairs replaced the thunder of war. Yet everyone knew the truce was a thin layer of ice over deep, cold waters. The moat-filling clause of the treaty had gutted the castle's defensive strength. The massive moats that had once kept Tokugawa troops at bay were now shallow ditches or flat earth, leaving the walls exposed to direct assault. Some Toyotomi retainers whispered that accepting such terms had been a fatal mistake, while others insisted it had been the only way to save Osaka from destruction in winter. Despite this vulnerability, Hideyori and his commanders began preparing for the possibility of renewed conflict. Weapons were repaired and restocked, and skilled ronin were again recruited from across Japan. The most famous among them, Sanada Yukimura, returned to his work reinforcing the Sanada Maru and strengthening what fortifications remained. Without the moats, defense would hinge on smaller strongpoints and fierce close-quarter fighting. The Tokugawa, for their part, wasted no time in watching for an excuse to break the truce. Ieyasu's agents in Kyoto and Osaka reported every movement inside the castle, every arrival of new warriors, every whispered plan. Letters were intercepted, and rumours spread that the Toyotomi were plotting to rally anti-Tokugawa factions across the country. By spring, the political situation grew tense once more. Ieyasu accused Hideyori of violating the peace terms, pointing to the recruitment of more ronin as proof of hostile intent. Whether this was true or merely a pretext, hardly mattered. The shogunate had all it needed to justify war in the eyes of the daimyo. In Osaka, the Toyotomi court debated furiously. Some urged Hideyori to negotiate again, to send hostages to Edo in a last attempt at reconciliation. Others argued that the Tokugawa would never be satisfied until the Toyotomi name was erased entirely, making resistance the only honourable path. By early summer of 1615, the time for debate was over. The Tokugawa armies began to mobilize once more, this time under the warm skies of the campaigning season. The summer campaign was coming, and for Osaka Castle, it would be the last stand. In May 1615, the Tokugawa army marched once more toward Osaka, this time with no intention of negotiation. The force was immense, over 150,000 soldiers, a mix of samurai, ashigaru, and allied domain troops from across Japan. At its head were Shogun Hidetada and the ever-watchful Tokugawa Ieyasu, now determined to erase the Toyotomi threat once and for all. The Toyotomi, though outnumbered, had not been idle. Hideyori had gathered roughly 55,000 defenders, many of them veteran Ronin hardened by years of wandering after Sekigahara. At the forefront was Sanada Yukimura, once again tasked with shoring up the castle's defences despite the absence of the protective moats. His strategy would be aggressive, meeting the Tokugawa in the field before they could fully encircle the castle. The first major clash came at Domyoji, where Toyotomi forces under Goto Matabe attempted to halt the Tokugawa advance. Matabe's troops fought fiercely, but a combination of poor coordination and overwhelming enemy numbers forced them into retreat. Matabe himself was killed in the chaos, a devastating loss for Toyotomi morale. Meanwhile, at Yao and Wakai, other Toyotomi detachments tried to check the Tokugawa flanks. Sanada Yukimura led one such force in a series of daring counterattacks, using his deep knowledge of the terrain to harass and delay the enemy. His red-armoured troops struck like lightning, inflicting heavy casualties before withdrawing to avoid being surrounded. Despite these spirited defences, the weight of Tokugawa manpower began to tell. The loss of the moats meant that the enemy could push siege lines dangerously close to Osaka Castle itself. Cannon fire once again shook the walls, and Tokugawa sappers worked to undermine the gates. By mid-June, the Tokugawa had tightened their grip. Skirmishes erupted almost daily, with the defenders launching sorties to burn siege works and disrupt supply lines. But each sortie cost men the Toyotomi could not replace. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was tense, but resolute. There was no expectation of mercy should they fall. The summer campaign had opened with blood and fire, and the noose was drawing tighter around Osaka. The stage was set for the decisive battle that would determine not only the fate of the Toyotomi, but the future of Japan itself. By late June 1615, the siege had reached its climax. The Tokugawa army had pushed their lines almost to the castle's walls, their artillery pounding day and night. Fires broke out across the outer compounds, and every hour brought the defenders fewer places to retreat. Sanada Yukimura, the unshakable heart of the Toyotomi resistance, knew the end was near, but he refused to surrender without one last stand. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Tennoji, fought just outside Osaka's southern gate. Yukimura led a desperate counterattack, rallying his red-armoured troops into a furious charge that momentarily broke the Tokugawa lines. It was a brilliant, almost suicidal maneuver, and for a brief moment it seemed the Toyotomi might turn the tide. But the enemy's superior numbers closed in from all sides, and Yukimura was mortally wounded in the chaos. His last reported words, encouraging his men to fight on, echoed through the ranks even as his banner fell. With their greatest commander gone, Toyotomi forces collapsed under relentless pressure. The Tokugawa surged forward, breaching the weakened gates and flooding into the castle grounds. Fighting raged through courtyards and corridors, steel flashing in the smoke-filled air. Civilians and warriors alike scrambled for safety, though for many there was none to be found. In the main keep, Toyotomi Hideyori and his mother, Yodogimi, chose not to fall into enemy hands. As flames consumed the surrounding buildings, they committed seppuku, ending their lives in the warrior tradition. The keep itself was set ablaze, its great timbers cracking and collapsing as the sky over Osaka turned black with smoke. By evening, the siege was over. The Tokugawa had won a total ruthless victory. The Toyotomi clan was erased from political power, and Osaka Castle lay in ruins. The city, once a vibrant center of trade and culture, was left scarred and silent. For Tokugawa Ieyasu, this was the final act in the unification of Japan. With his rivals destroyed, his family's control over the country would last for more than 2 centuries. But the price was steep. The Siege of Osaka had claimed tens of thousands of lives and left behind a legacy of both awe and tragedy, remembered as the last great battle of Japan's age of the samurai. Khutulun was born around 1260, when the Mongol Empire was still one of the largest and most feared realms in history. She was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan through her father, Kaidu, the powerful Khan of the Chagatai Khanate, a ruler whose authority stretched over much of Central Asia. This was not a peaceful, settled land of stone cities and quiet fields. Khutulun's childhood unfolded on the endless steppes, where survival depended on speed, strength, and an intimate understanding of the land. Life for a Mongol child began in the saddle. Horses were as essential as air and water, and Khutulun learned to ride before she could walk steadily. From her earliest days, she was trained in the ways of her people, drawing a bow while galloping at full speed, wrestling with older siblings until the dust rose, and reading the moods of the wind and the herd. These were not pastimes. They were skills that meant the difference between life and death in a world defined by war and mobility. Her father, Kaidu, was locked in constant political and military struggle with his cousins in the Great Khan's court, particularly Kublai Khan in China. This environment meant Khutulun grew up not in the sheltered luxury of a palace, but in military camps, surrounded by warriors, strategists, and the constant movement of armies. The clang of weapons and the shouts of soldiers were as familiar to her as the songs sung around the evening fire. Mongol culture valued strength and skill over mere lineage, and Khutulun's talents soon became impossible to ignore. Even as a child, she could ride longer, wrestle harder, and shoot straighter than boys older than her. She was not encouraged to follow the traditional path of a Mongol noblewoman, arranging marriages and managing the domestic side of a nomadic household, but to train alongside her father's warriors. Her mother and other women of the camp still taught her the domestic skills expected of a noble's daughter, but Khutulun's destiny was already shaping into something different. Her parents understood that in the harsh, competitive political landscape of the late Mongol Empire, a daughter who could command respect on the battlefield would be as valuable as any son. By the time she reached her teenage years, Khutulun had already begun to carve out a reputation, not simply as Kaidu's daughter, but as a warrior in her own right. By the time Khutulun reached her teenage years, her life was already intertwined with the rhythm of war. The Mongol Empire of her youth was no longer the unified machine it had been under Genghis Khan. It was fractured, with rival branches of the royal family vying for dominance. Her father, Kaidu, was one of the most formidable of these claimants, a military leader whose defiance of Kublai Khan placed him in constant conflict with the Yuan dynasty to the east and rival Khanates to the west. In this turbulent world, Khutulun did not remain a mere observer. She rode alongside her father's army, not as a ceremonial figure, but as an active participant. Campaigns were grueling affairs. Long rides across deserts and mountains, sudden clashes with enemy scouts, and full-scale battles where the fate of whole regions could shift in a day. Khutulun proved herself in these environments, wielding her bow and spear with the precision of a seasoned warrior. Contemporary accounts, particularly those from the Venetian traveller Marco Polo, describe her as unmatched in the field. He claimed she could seize an enemy soldier from horseback, drag him back to her own lines, and do so without breaking her pace. This was no exaggeration, meant to romanticize her image. Mongol cavalry tactics demanded such feats, and Khutulun excelled at them. Her father valued her presence not only for her skill in combat, but also for the morale it inspired. Soldiers fought harder, knowing Khutulun rode among them, a living symbol of their cause, and proof that courage was not limited by gender. Her white horse became a recognizable sight on the battlefield, and her red-lined armor marked her as someone not to be underestimated. It was during these campaigns that Khutulun developed the fierce independence and tactical mind that would define her later fame. She learned to read the flow of battle, to anticipate enemy maneuvers, and to strike at the perfect moment. These were not skills acquired in training alone. They were forged in the chaos of real combat, where mistakes cost lives. By her early 20s, Khutulun was not just the daughter of Kaidu, but one of his most trusted commanders. Her reputation as a warrior princess had spread far beyond the Chagatai Khanate, earning both admiration and resentment in equal measure. Among the Mongols, wrestling, Burk, was more than a sport. It was a test of strength, agility, and honor, performed at festivals, celebrations, and gatherings of the tribes. Victory in the wrestling ring could bring prestige equal to triumph on the battlefield. For Khutulun, whose skills already matched the finest warriors, it was another arena in which to prove herself. As the stories go, Khutulun issued a challenge to the men of the steppe. She would only marry the man who could defeat her in wrestling. This was no idle boast. Wrestling among the Mongols was a contest without weight divisions, and her opponents would be full-grown warriors, many of them veterans hardened by war. Yet Khutulun knew her own strength. Years of training in horseback riding, archery, and the brutal physicality of steppe life had given her a body and reflexes built for this exact kind of contest. When the first suitors came forward, the matches ended quickly. Khutulun's technique was clean and decisive. She would hook a leg, shift her weight with lightning speed, and send her opponent sprawling in the dust before the crowd had finished cheering. Her victories were not just physical, but psychological. Each man who fell to her added to the aura of her invincibility. But her challenge wasn't just about strength, it was a way of controlling her fate. In a time when noble marriages were often political arrangements, Khutulun used wrestling to set her own terms. If no man could beat her, then no one could force her into a union she didn't want. As her fame grew, more suitors tried their luck, some travelling from distant lands for the chance. Yet all met the same fate, thrown to the ground and sent away with bruised pride. The challenge became a matter of legend, whispered in markets and sung by bards. To win Khutulun's hand, you must first throw her to the earth. No one ever did. For the crowds, it was entertainment. For Khutulun, it was a statement. She would be no passive prize in the games of men. On the dusty plains of the steppe, in the centre of the wrestling circle, she was her own master, stronger, faster, and cleverer than anyone who dared face her. Khutulun's wrestling challenge soon became more than a test of strength. It became a high-stakes contest of wealth and pride. To deter casual challengers and add weight to her terms, she introduced a rule. Any man who wished to wrestle her for marriage had to wager 100 horses. If he lost, she kept them. If he won, he would gain both the horses and her hand. In the horse-rich culture of the Mongols, this was no trivial bet. Horses were the lifeblood of the steppe, transport, wealth, and status all in one. To wager 100 meant risking a significant portion of one's fortune. It also meant that the men who dared face her were not only confident in their strength, but willing to gamble a small empire of hooves. Khutulun did not disappoint her supporters. One after another, her suitors found themselves slammed to the ground, their shoulders pressed into the dust, the match over before they could recover. Each loss meant the transfer of a precious herd into Khutulun's possession. The white, bay, and chestnut horses multiplied under her care until she reportedly owned thousands. Marco Polo, who claimed to have heard of her exploits firsthand during his travels, estimated her herd at around 10,000. These victories elevated her legend beyond the wrestling circle. She was no longer just the warrior princess who rode into battle. She was the undefeated champion whose skill had built a fortune in living, breathing wealth. For some, she became a figure of admiration. For others, a source of frustration. Every man who failed to beat her lost more than horses. He lost face in front of the entire tribe. But the wager was never purely about greed. By demanding such a high stake, Khutulun ensured that only the most determined would dare to try, filtering out the half-hearted and the foolish. It was also a way to keep control of her marital fate. No father, no Khan, could force her to accept a match that hadn't been earned in the ring. By the time her herd reached its legendary size, Khutulun's challenge had become the stuff of song and story. Suitors still came, but they came knowing that the odds were against them, not because she was lucky, but because she was the best. While her wrestling victories brought her fame across the Mongol world, Khutulun's true power lay in the saddle, where the games of sport turned into the deadly contests of war. Her father, Kaidu, was constantly engaged in campaigns against rival Khans, and Khutulun was not content to watch from the sidelines. She rode in the thick of battle, her red-trimmed armor glinting in the sun, her bow and spear never idle. Contemporary reports, including those of Marco Polo, claimed she was unmatched in the art of seizing enemies alive from horseback. In the chaos of battle, she would single out a rider, close the distance at full gallop, and wrench him from his saddle in one powerful motion, dragging her captive back through the melee to her own lines. This feat required more than raw strength. It demanded precision, timing, and the fearless nerve to charge headlong into danger. Her presence in the army was more than symbolic. Kaidu often entrusted her with leading flanking attacks or securing vital positions on the battlefield. The men under her command respected her not simply because she was their Khan's daughter, but because she had proven herself again and again in combat. Warriors fought harder with Khutulun nearby, inspired by the sight of a commander who could best them in sport and match them in war. The fusion of her wrestling and military reputations created a unique image. Khutulun was not only a champion of the wrestling ring, but also a living weapon on the steppe. Her skill in both arenas reinforced her authority and autonomy in a way that few women, even among the Mongols, could achieve. Her enemies, however, did not share this admiration. In the courts of her rivals, Khutulun was painted as a dangerous figure, one whose defiance of marriage norms and prowess in battle upset the balance of political alliances. Every time she humiliated a suitor, or defeated a Toktamish, or Yuan-aligned force, she was making a statement. The daughter of Kaidu could not be tamed. For Khutulun, wrestling and war were two sides of the same coin. Whether in the circle of sand or the open plain, the rules were simple. Outmatch your opponent, control the fight, and never surrender the ground you've claimed. Khutulun's life was not only shaped by her own feats, but by her deep loyalty to her father, Kaidu Khan, ruler of the Chagatai Khanate. Kaidu was a shrewd and determined leader, a cousin and fierce rival of Kublai Khan, the powerful ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China. Their rivalry was more than personal. It was a clash over the future of the Mongol Empire itself. Kublai embraced the trappings of Chinese imperial rule, while Kaidu clung to the traditional nomadic ways of Genghis Khan. In this high-stakes power struggle, Khutulun was more than a daughter. She was Kaidu's most trusted lieutenant. She accompanied him on military campaigns against Kublai's forces and other Mongol factions that sought to challenge his rule. On the battlefield, she was often at his side, acting not only as a warrior, but as an advisor, her insight valued as much as her strength. Her political role extended beyond combat. In the Mongol system, alliances were often cemented through marriage, and Kaidu's rivals undoubtedly saw Khutulun as a potential bargaining chip. Yet her marriage challenge, defeat her in wrestling or win nothing, was as much a political shield as it was a personal choice. By keeping herself unmarried, she denied her father's enemies any leverage they might gain through her hand. This defiance did not go unnoticed. Chronicles suggest that Khutulun's influence in court was significant enough to draw envy and suspicion from other nobles. Some accused her of overstepping her role, others of holding undue sway over her father's decisions. But Kaidu never seemed to doubt her loyalty or capability. To him, Khutulun was an essential part of his campaign, to preserve the independence and traditions of their branch of the Mongol Empire. Her closeness to her father also meant she shared in his political burdens. When Kaidu's wars dragged on, bringing strain to the Khanate's resources and alliances, Khutulun was there to negotiate truces, rally troops, and keep wavering allies in the fold. Her presence reminded everyone that Kaidu's leadership was backed by more than bloodline. It was defended by a warrior who embodied the spirit of the steppe. In those years, Khutulun's identity became inseparable from her father's cause. She was not only his protector and champion, but also his heir in spirit, the living proof that the old Mongol ways were still alive and undefeated. In 1301, Khutulun's world shifted forever. Her father, Kaidu Khan, the unyielding ruler who had fought for decades to keep the Mongol Empire's heartlands independent from Kublai Khan's influence, died after years of war and political maneuvering. His passing left a dangerous power vacuum in the Chagatai Khanate, and with it came the question, who would lead? Kaidu had reportedly considered Khutulun as a successor,